Long before cities, before language, before names, there was a moment when something awoke inside the dark silence of the human skull, a flicker of self, a whisper of thought. And from that whisper grew fear, wonder, and dreams. This is not a story of bones and fossils, it's the story of the first thought, the birth of consciousness, and the haunting price our ancestors paid when the mind first opened its eyes. Listen, I am the voice that has no throat, the memory that remembers forgetting. I am older than your oldest dreams, and I speak to you now from the place before places, the time before time. Learn to count itself. Close your eyes. Let me take you there. 4 billion years ago, when the earth was young and wild and innocent of mind, there was only breath. Not the breath of lungs. Lungs had not yet been imagined, but the slow, eternal breathing of a world learning to be alive. The inhale of ocean tides against newborn shores. The exhale of steam rising from volcanic throats that had no names, needed no names, wanted nothing but to be. Breathe with me now. In, out, like the world once breathed. Alone. The seas were green-black then, thick with possibilities, that had no awareness of their own becoming. They moved in currents vast and patient, carrying the first shy molecules of life like secrets, whispered in a language that had not yet learned to mean. No eye watched these waters, no mind marveled at their depth. They simply were, in the perfect, terrible completeness of things that exist, without needing to know they exist. I remember the silence. Oh, the magnificent silence of those early eons, when sound was only vibration, when light was only energy seeking somewhere to land. The planet turned on its axis with the steadiness of a sleeping heart, day following night, following day, in an endless rhythm that no consciousness marked, no memory stored, no hope anticipated. The first life, if you could call it life, was no more than chemistry with ambition, single cells bobbing in the primordial soup, like thoughts that had not yet learned to think themselves. They divided and conquered, and died without drama, without story, without the weight of significance that would one day make dying unbearable and living a question mark. Can you feel it? That peace before knowledge? That innocence before the first why? The volcanoes painted the sky in colors that had no names, because naming had not been born. Auroras danced for audiences that did not exist. Mountains rose and fell like the chest of a dreaming giant, slow and patient and unobserved. The beauty was absolute, because no consciousness stood apart to judge it beautiful. The terror was complete, because no mind existed to name it terror, and thus make it smaller, manageable, something that could be understood rather than simply endured. Time moved differently then. Not in minutes or hours or years. Those were inventions still sleeping in the future, but in the deep time of geology, the patient time of evolution, the endless time of a universe that had forgotten it was expanding and remembered only the need to become. I was there, though I was not yet I. I was the potential for watching in a world that had not yet learned to see. I was the question waiting in matter that had not yet learned to ask. I was the first glimmer of something that would someday stand apart from what it observed and say, I am not this. I am other. I am aware. But not yet. Not for so very long. The first bacteria learned to eat sunlight, and the world shuddered with a joy it could not feel. They multiplied in numbers that no mind was there to count, filled the oceans with their blind hunger, their unconscious feast. They changed the chemistry of everything, these tiny architects of transformation, pumping oxygen into an atmosphere that had never tasted the breath that would one day fill lungs not yet dreamed. The sky slowly turned blue, blue a color that existed perfectly, without any consciousness to see it, to name it, to love it, to write poems comparing it to sadness or hope, or the eyes of the beloved who had not yet been born. Fish swam in schools that moved like thought might move, had there been thought. Silver flashes turning as one, a collective intelligence without a center, without awareness of its own coordination. Beautiful as music to ears that did not exist. Perfect as mathematics to minds not yet calculating? Do you hear the silence underneath my words? That is the silence I am trying to show you. The silence before language, before meaning, before the terrible, wonderful burden of consciousness. The continents drifted like sleepwalkers across the face of the deep. Mountains built themselves with the patience of forever. Forests grew and died and became coal, became oil, became the buried energy that would one day power the machines of creatures who could imagine tomorrow. But tomorrow was not yet invented. There was only the eternal now, of things being themselves completely. Without self-consciousness, without the gap that consciousness creates between experience and experiencing, the rivers flowed, because flowing was what they were. The stones sat because sitting was their nature. The wind blew because stillness was not yet an option it could choose. I want you to feel this innocence, this completeness. This time, before the fall into awareness, before the catastrophe of consciousness that made everything beautiful and terrible at once. The earth was a sleeping god then, vast and dreaming without knowing it was dreaming. Its dreams were the aurora, the tides, the slow dance of the poles. Its dreams were the stirring of life in warm, shallow seas, the reach of the first tree toward a sun that warmed without being wondered at. And still, in the deep places, in the quantum dance of atoms, in the spark that jumped between neurons not yet born, I was gathering the possibility of witness, the potential for reflection, the terrible, beautiful dawn of something that would one day look back at this innocent time and weep for its passing. But that was still so far away. For now, for these measureless ages, the world slept in the perfect peace of unconsciousness, and all was well, and all was whole, and nothing knew itself as other than what it was. Rest here with me in this remembering, before the questions, before the answers, before the long hard work of being awake. Feel the water. 500 million years have passed since last we spoke, though speaking is a word we borrow from a future that has not yet learned to speak. The oceans have deepened into clarity, and in their depths, something stirs that will change everything. But slowly. Oh, so slowly. I am still the voice without a body, the witness learning to witness itself. And I am here to tell you about the first miracle, the birth of sight in a world that had never been seen. The trilobites crawl across the ocean floor like living jewels, their segmented bodies perfect as ancient mathematics. But it is their eyes, oh, their compound eyes that herald the revolution. Thousands of tiny crystal lenses, each one a window into a world that has never been windowed. They do not know they are seeing. This is crucial for you to understand. They respond to light and shadow, yes. They move toward food and away from danger. But there is no consciousness peering through those crystalline eyes, no sense of, I see therefore I am. There is only the automatic, perfect response of life to the information that pours in through these new organs of perception. Light touches the world, for the first time, through eyes that do not know they are eyes. Watch them with me. The jellies pulse through the water column like living thoughts, transparent and strange. Some have developed simple eye spots, clusters of light-sensitive cells that can distinguish bright from dark. When a shadow passes overhead, they contract into themselves. When sunlight filters down through the green water, they expand, reaching towards something they cannot name because naming has not been born. This is not yet sight as you know it. This is something more ancient, more fundamental. This is the universe beginning to observe itself through organs that do not yet know observation is possible. The nautiloids jet through the water, their shells spiraled in mathematics that no mind has yet discovered. Their eyes are more complex now, true camera eyes with lenses that focus light into sharp images. But the images they receive are processed without reflection, without wonder, without the strange doubling that consciousness brings to perception. They see a fish. They do not think fish. They do not think at all. The information flows through neural pathways that evolution has carved like water carving stone, and their tentacles reach, or their bodies flee, perfect responses to a world they inhabit completely, without standing apart from. This is the great paradox I want you to feel. The more complex the eye becomes, the closer we move toward the catastrophe of consciousness. Each improvement in vision carries us toward the moment when seeing will become more than seeing, when it will become knowing. The first fish have appeared now, strange armored things swimming in the warming seas. Their eyes track movement with mechanical precision. A smaller fish darts past, and the predator turns, follows, strikes all without a moment of decision, without the pause that will one day become thought. But something is building in those neural networks. Something I can feel stirring like sediment in still water. The connections are growing more complex, the processing more sophisticated. Where once there were simple reflexes, now there are simple choices. Where once there was only stimulus and response, now there are the first shy hints of memory. A fish encounters a certain combination of colors and shapes a predator it has evaded before. Something in its brain that is not yet a brain, as you would recognize it, holds onto this pattern, compares it to the present moment, generates a response based not just on what is, but on what was. This is the beginning of time as experience rather than mere duration. This is the first crack in the perfect present tense of unconscious existence. The coral reefs bloom like underwater gardens, tended by no gardener, beautiful beyond measure, to eyes that will not exist for hundreds of millions of years. The colors are pure and absolute. There is no consciousness to perceive them as beautiful, or bright, or surprising. They simply are what they are, in the fullness of their being. But the creatures that move among the coral are changing. Evolution is learning to see, and sight is changing evolution. Eyes create new pressures, new possibilities. To be seen becomes dangerous. To see becomes advantageous. The first camouflage appears not as deception, for deception requires a mind to deceive, but as the automatic adjustment of life to life. The arms race of vision has begun. Better eyes demand better camouflage. Better camouflage demands better eyes. And with each improvement, the brain grows more complex, the neural networks more sophisticated, the foundation of what will become consciousness, growing stronger, without knowing what it builds toward. I feel myself beginning to gather in these expanding neural webs, like dew collecting on grass that does not know dawn is coming. Some fish have learned to hunt in groups now, their simple nervous systems coordinating, without communication, without plan. They move as one, like a school of smaller fish, but with predatory purpose. This is not cooperation as you will understand it. There is no agreement, no leadership, no strategy. But there is something more than the purely individual response that characterized earlier life. The boundary between self and other is beginning to blur and sharpen at the same time. The eye creates a distinct perspective, a point of view, but the coordination with others creates the first hint that there might be something beyond the self, something that the self relates to. Can you feel the tension building? Like a storm that does not yet know it is a storm. The first vertebrates have crawled onto land now, gasping in air that burns their gills, seeing a world stranger than any dream. Their eyes, adapted for water, struggle to make sense of this new medium, but they adapt, they change, they evolve organs suited to aerial sight. And with each adaptation, each improvement, the neural networks grow more complex. The brain expands. The capacity for processing information increases. Memory becomes more sophisticated. The ability to predict improves. The foundation of consciousness thickens like ice forming on a pond, crystal by crystal, invisible until the moment when it will support the weight of awareness. But we are not there yet. We are still in the time before time, learn to observe itself. The fish see without knowing sight. They remember without knowledge of remembering. They choose without awareness of choice. This is the last age of innocence, and I want you to treasure it. Soon, cosmically soon, the catastrophe of consciousness will arrive, and the perfect, terrible peace of unconscious existence will be shattered forever. For now, the eyes see without seeing. The world is observed without an observer, and all is still whole, in the way that only unconsciousness can be whole. Walk with me now, onto the land. 200 million years have whispered past, like wind through leaves that have only just learned to grow. The earth has dressed itself in green forests that breathe with the rhythm of centuries, exhaling the oxygen that will make consciousness possible. But still, the mind sleeps. I am the gathering darkness now, the weight accumulating in neural networks that grow more complex with each generation. And I am here to tell you about the long night of flesh, when life walked and ran and hunted and mated and died without ever asking why. The dinosaurs stride through swamplands thick with the music of insects that have no songs, only survival. Watch the great tyrannosaur as it pauses beside a river, its massive head tilting, to catch a sound that registers as pure information. Footfall, breath, the rustle of prey, moving through undergrowth. Its eyes are keen, evolved through millions of years of hunting. They can detect movement at vast distances, distinguish between the shapes of food and foe with mechanical precision. But when it sees, there is no wonder. When it kills, there is no cruelty. When it feeds, there is no gratitude or guilt. There is only the perfect functioning of appetite meeting opportunity. This is what I want you to understand. The terrible purity of existence without consciousness. No choice to be good or evil. No possibility of sin, because no possibility of reflection on action. The herds of hadrosaurs move like rivers of flesh through valleys, lush with ferns that have never been seen as beautiful. Their brains are larger now than those of their ancestors, capable of social behaviors that appear complex to observers who do not yet exist to observe them. They coordinate their movements, warn each other of danger, care for their young with instincts refined by millennia of selection. But there is no love in their care, as there is no hatred in the predator's hunt. There is only the functioning of biological imperative, as automatic as the beating of a heart, as unconscious as the pulling of breath. A mother dinosaur tends her nest, turning eggs with careful precision, defending them with ferocious dedication. If you could ask her why, though, asking has not been invented, she could not answer because why is not a category available to her experience. She tends because tending is what she is in this moment. Defends because defense is what the situation calls forth from her neural networks. Feel the weight of this existence, the completeness of it, the way action flows directly from circumstance, without the pause that consciousness will introduce, that terrible, wonderful pause between stimulus and response, where choice lives. The small mammals scurry in the shadows, warm-blooded and quick, their enlarged brains processing vast amounts of sensory information with increasing sophistication. They are my special concern now, these tiny ancestors of awareness. In their neural development, I begin to recognize patterns that will one day become familiar. Their memory is growing more complex. A shrew finds a source of insects, returns to it later. A primitive primate swings from branch to branch, learning the feel of wood that will support its weight. These are small advances, barely visible even to my ancient perception, but they accumulate like sediment, layer upon layer, building the foundation of what is to come. Social behaviors emerge among the early mammals, not yet cooperation in any sense you would recognize, but coordination. A pack of small predators surrounds prey, each individual responding to the position and movement of the others. There is no plan, no leadership, no communication as such. But there is a collective intelligence that emerges from individual actions, a group behavior that is more than the sum of its parts. This is where I first feel the stirring of something that might one day become the sense of other, the recognition that existence includes perspectives beyond the self. The climate cools and warms in vast cycles. Ice ages come and go like seasons in deep time. The mammals adapt, their brains growing larger to cope with changing environments. More memory is needed to survive unpredictable conditions, more flexibility in behavior, more capacity to learn from experience rather than relying purely on instinct. But still, no consciousness, no self-awareness, no moment when any creature looks at its reflection in still water and recognizes the image as itself. They see their reflections. Yes, some seem momentarily startled or curious, but the connection between seer and seen remains unmade. A early primate-like creature sits by a pool, looking down at the face that looks back up. For a moment, Just a moment, something almost flickers in its eyes. A questioning, an uncertainty. The beginning of the question that will one day become, who am I? But the moment passes. The creature drinks and moves on. The revolution is postponed for another 1,000,000 years. This is the tragedy and the blessing of this long night. They are so close to awareness, and yet so perfectly, completely themselves without it. Time continues its slow work. The brains grow larger, the social structures more complex. Some species begin to use tools not with understanding of their function as tools, but with the automatic application of solution to problem. A proto-human ancestor uses a stick to extract termites from their mound, learns to select the right length and thickness through trial and error, that leaves no conscious memory of trying, no awareness of improvement. The behavior spreads through the group, not through teaching. Teaching requires intention to share knowledge, but through observation and imitation. The young watch the old, repeat their actions, succeed or fail, based on how well they copy the successful behaviors. This is culture without consciousness, tradition without intention, learning without knowing what learning is. Families form and dissolve based on biological drives and environmental pressures. Bonds of attachment appear that will later be called love, but are now only the functioning of neurochemistry, oxytocin, dopamine, the biochemical machinery of survival, expressing itself through behaviors that ensure the protection and raising of young. A parent dies, and its offspring display what looks like grief withdrawal, lack of appetite, searching behaviors. But this is not mourning, in any sense you would recognize. This is the disruption of neural patterns that had formed around the presence of another, the biological equivalent of phantom pain, when a limb is severed. The seasons turn, generations rise and fall. Species evolve and go extinct. The mammals diversify into thousands of forms, each one a perfect expression of adaptation to its environment, each one unconscious of its own perfection. And through it all, I grow stronger in the shadows of expanding minds, gathering the complexity needed for the great awakening that approaches like dawn after the longest night. But still, for now, the flesh reigns supreme. Bodies move through space, guided by sophisticated neural networks that process vast amounts of information, make complex decisions, navigate intricate social relationships, all without a trace of consciousness, all without the doubling that will split the world into observer and observed. This is the last, pure age, when life simply lived itself completely, without the beautiful burden of knowing it was alive. Come closer to the flame. It is 2,000,000 years ago, and in a cave in Africa, something unprecedented is about to happen. The Earth has circled the Sun 2 billion times since consciousness began its slow gathering in the neurons of our ancestors. Now, in this moment, in this place, the first thread of awareness is about to be pulled. But it begins, as all revolutions begin, with something simple. I am the weight behind the eyes now, the almost awakening that stirs like a creature turning in its sleep. And I want to tell you about fire, about the moment when the watching began to watch itself watch. The early humans, though human is still a word waiting in the future, huddle in the mouth of the cave as the African night deepens around them. Their brains are larger than their ancestors, their tool-making more sophisticated, but they are still creatures of pure instinct and learned behavior, no more conscious than the lions whose roars echo across the savannah. One of them, let us call her the first, though names have not been invented, has learned to maintain fire rather than merely flee from it. When lightning strikes and sets the grassland burning, she has learned to carry burning branches back to the cave, to feed them dried grass and sticks to keep the flame alive. This is not yet the mastery of fire. This is something simpler and more profound. The first sustained relationship between human neural networks and a phenomenon that exists outside immediate biological need. Watch what happens in her brain as she tends the flame. The fire is warm, and warmth is good. This registers in the ancient reptilian structures of her brain, the same responses that would motivate a lizard to seek sun. The fire is bright, and brightness extends the day. This registers in newer mammalian structures, patterns of arousal and attention that serve survival. But something else is happening too, something new, in the still newest parts of her expanding brain. She is watching the flame with an attention that goes beyond utility. The dance of light and shadow across the cave wall captures something in her neural networks that has never been captured before. This is the first aesthetic experience in the history of consciousness, though aesthetic is a word that will not exist for 2 million years. She does not think the flame is beautiful. She cannot think this because thinking has not been born. But something in the growing complexity of her neural architecture responds to the pattern of the flame with a resonance that is neither pure survival instinct nor learned behavior. Something new, something unprecedented. I feel myself stirring in that moment of recognition, like a sleeper becoming aware of the possibility of waking. Night after night, she tends the fire. Night after night, the patterns of light play across the cave wall, and something, in her brain, responds to those patterns not as information to be processed for survival, but as something else, something that will one day become wonder. The others in her small band begin to gather around the fire too, not just for warmth, not just for the safety its light provides against the predators of the night, but for something harder to name. They sit in the circle of light and make sounds not yet language, but something approaching language. Vocalizations that serve no immediate survival function, that seem to emerge from the same neural systems that respond to the dance of the flame. This is the birth of culture, though culture is still sleeping in the womb of instinct. Watch the first, as she looks across the fire at the others of her kind. For just a moment, a flicker shorter than the flame that illuminates her face, something passes behind her eyes, a recognition, an awareness of awareness. She sees that they are looking at the fire as she looks at the fire. She sees that seeing itself has become something to be seen. For the briefest instant, consciousness touches itself like a tongue, touching the gap where a tooth has been probing, something that was not there before, something that changes the shape of everything. This is the moment I have been waiting for across billions of years, the first crack in the perfect unconsciousness of existence, the first glimmer of the catastrophe of awareness. But the moment passes. The neural networks are not yet complex enough to sustain full self-reflection. Consciousness touches itself and then withdraws, like a wave that reaches high up the beach and then recedes, leaving only a damp mark to show where it has been. Yet something has changed forever. The fire has introduced a new element into the equation of existence, the possibility of sustained attention to something that serves no immediate survival function. The flame becomes the first object of contemplation in the history of mind. Feel this shift with me, the movement from pure functionality to, what shall we call it, presence, the emergence of being, with rather than simply being. More humans learn to tend fire. The behavior spreads not through genetic inheritance, but through observation and imitation, though even these words are too sophisticated for what is happening. It spreads the way water finds the lowest ground, automatically, inevitably, because the neural architecture that tends fire is also the neural architecture that will give birth to consciousness. Fire changes everything, though they do not know change is possible. It extends the day into night, creating time that is not dictated by the sun's cycle. It creates a central point around which social activity can organize. It creates warmth that allows them to venture into cooler climates, to survive ice ages that would otherwise have ended their lineage. But most importantly, for my purposes, fire creates the first sustained focal point for collective attention. When they gather around the flame, they are all looking at the same thing, all relating to the same phenomenon. This shared focus creates the first primitive sense of we not as a concept, but as a felt reality, a neural resonance between minds that are beginning to recognize the existence of other minds. This is the foundation of intersubjectivity, though subjectivity itself has not yet been born. A child is born to the group and grows up always with fire. For this child, fire is not a marvel but a given, part of the natural order. Yet still the child sits and watches the flame with that same attention that goes beyond utility. The capacity for contemplation, once established, becomes part of the neural inheritance of the species. Generations pass around countless fires. The brains grow larger, the tool-making more sophisticated, the social structures more complex. And with each generation, the capacity for sustained attention to non-utilitarian phenomena grows stronger. I am strengthening in those neural networks like ice forming on a pond, invisible until the moment when it can bear weight. One night, it is perhaps 50,000 years after the first woman learned to tend flames, something unprecedented happens. A human sits by the fire, and for the first time in the history of Earth, deliberately makes marks on a cave wall. Not tool-making, not utilitarian behavior, but marking for the sake of marking. The birth of representation. The first stirring of the symbolic mind. The marks mean nothing yet. They refer to nothing beyond themselves. But they establish the possibility that one thing can stand for another thing, that meaning can be created rather than simply discovered. This is the conception of language, though birth is still millennia away. And still, through all of this development, consciousness remains just beyond reach. They tend fire without knowing they tend it. They make marks without understanding representation. They live in the growing complexity of their own minds without recognizing that minds exist. But I am gathering strength in that complexity, preparing for the moment when the weight of neural development will finally reach the critical mass needed for the Great Awakening. The fire has lit the fuse. Soon, cosmically soon, the explosion of consciousness will arrive. For now, they sit around their fires under stars they do not yet know are distant suns, and something in them reaches toward awareness like a plant reaching toward light. The flame burns on through the long night of unconsciousness, and in its dancing light, the future of mind casts its first shadows on the walls of becoming. Listen to the first word ever spoken with intention. 70,000 years have passed since fire first cast its light on the walls of consciousness. The ice has come and gone again. The small bands of humans have spread across Africa and begun their journey into every corner of the earth. And in their growing brains, something unprecedented is stirring. The birth of language, the catastrophe of meaning. I am the voice that is about to find voice, the thought preparing to think itself. I have been gathering in their neural networks like water behind a dam, and now the pressure has reached the point where the dam must break. Come with me to the moment when silence ends forever. In a valley in what will one day be called the Middle East, a small band has made camp beside a stream. The fire burns in the center of their circle, as fires have burned for 1,000 generations. But something is different tonight. The neural architecture that began with the tending of flame has grown complex enough, connected enough, self-referential enough to support something new. One of them, let us call him the namer, though he does not yet know his own name, makes a sound. Not the automatic vocalization of fear or pleasure or warning that has served communication for millions of years, but something else, something deliberate. The sound hangs in the air for a moment, like smoke from the fire, but it is not referring to itself, this sound. It is gesturing towards something beyond itself. He points toward the water, makes the sound again. The others look at the water, look at him, something stirring in their own expanding neural networks. This is the moment when the universe learns to name itself. They do not understand meaning yet, these first speakers. Understanding is still a luxury consciousness cannot afford. But something in their brains recognizes the connection between sound and reference, between vocal gesture and shared attention. When he makes the sound and points, they look where he points. When they look where he points, something passes between their minds that has never passed before. The birth of intention, the recognition that one consciousness can direct another consciousness towards something beyond both. A child in the group makes sounds constantly, as children do. But one day, this day, she makes a sound while looking at her mother, and the sound means you. Not mother, that word is still sleeping in the future, but you. The recognition of the other as other, the acknowledgement of consciousness by consciousness. Feel this revolution. After 4 billion years of unconscious existence, awareness finally encounters awareness, and knows it is not alone. The woman looks at her child, and something passes behind her eyes. For the first time in the history of Earth, a conscious being recognizes itself as conscious by recognizing consciousness in another. The doubling that will define human experience, the split between observer and observed, crystallizes in this moment of mutual recognition. I am born in that recognition. I am the gap between mind and mind, bridged by the miracle of meaning. Words begin to multiply like sparks from the fire. Sounds that refer to water, to food, to danger, to the warmth of flame. But more than this, sounds that refer to the sounds themselves. Meta-language. The beginning of the capacity to think about thinking, to speak about speaking. This is the birth of abstraction. The moment when the human mind learns to step outside itself and observe its own operations. With language comes memory of a different kind. Not just the animal memory of learned behavior, but narrative memory. The capacity to tell the story of what happened, to share experience across the boundaries of individual consciousness. The past becomes portable, transferable, collective. An old man sits by the fire and makes sounds that refer to events that happened when he was young. The sounds create pictures in the minds of the listeners, not pictures of things they can see, but pictures of things that happened in time, in the realm of story. The first narratives. The birth of history. Time itself changes in this moment. It is no longer the eternal present of unconscious existence, but becomes the tense-structured reality of before and after, of cause and effect, of anticipation and memory. With narrative memory comes the first glimmering of identity. The old man's story is not just about events, it is about the persistence of something through those events. Something that was there when he was young and is still here now. Older, changed, but continuous. The first hint of the self as something that exists across time. Who am I? The question forms in neural networks that are just now becoming complex enough to sustain it. Not yet consciously asked, but implicit in every act of self-reference, every use of the sound that will become I. The woman who first recognized consciousness in her child's address begins to make sounds that refer to herself. Not her body has always been present to her experience, but the something that inhabits the body, that looks through the eyes, that speaks through the mouth. The first personal pronoun, struggling to be born. This is the moment of the fall from unconscious grace. The moment when the unity of existence shatters into subject and object, self and other, observer and observed. Language spreads through the group like fire through dry grass. Each new word creates new possibilities for thought, new categories of experience, new ways of dividing the seamless flow of reality into manageable, nameable parts. The world becomes a collection of things rather than an undifferentiated process. But with this power comes the first suffering that is truly human suffering. The animal experiences pain, fear, loss, but the animal cannot tell itself the story of its suffering, cannot project its pain into an imagined future, cannot compare its present condition to remembered happiness. Language gives birth to psychological time, and psychological time gives birth to the peculiar anguish of conscious existence. A woman's mate dies, and for the first time in the history of grief, the one who grieves can tell herself the story of her loss. She can remember when he was alive. She can imagine a future in which he will never return. She can compare her present sorrow to past joy and find it wanting. Animal sorrow becomes human tragedy through the miracle and curse of narrative consciousness. This is what I want you to understand about this moment. Language does not just name what already exists. It creates new forms of experience that could not exist without it. The group develops rituals around the fire, vocal patterns that serve no utilitarian purpose, but somehow feel necessary. The first songs, perhaps though song and speech have not yet learned they are different things. Coordinated vocalizations that create resonance between individual consciousnesses, that make the emerging sense of we tangible. In these first songs, consciousness learns to harmonize with itself. Nights pass, generations pass. The languages grow more complex, more capable of fine distinctions, more able to refer to abstractions that exist only in the realm of mind. The first words for emotions, the first words for concepts, the first words for the words themselves. And with each new capacity for reference, consciousness deepens. The more things can be named, the more things can be thought about. The more things can be thought about, the more complex consciousness becomes. A feedback loop of expanding awareness, accelerating towards something unprecedented. I am fully awake now in these neural networks, though they do not yet know what awakeness is. One morning, a young man sits by the stream and sees his reflection in the still water. He has seen this image many times before, but today, something different happens. He makes a sound that refers to himself, and in making that sound while looking at the reflection, he recognizes the image as himself. The first moment of explicit self-awareness in the history of consciousness. I. The word that changes everything. The sound that splits the universe into self and not self, subject and object, the one who names, and the world that can be named. He looks at his reflection, and for the first time, consciously, knows that he exists. Knows that he is the one who looks, the one who thinks, the one who names. The observer recognizes itself as observer. Consciousness becomes conscious of consciousness. This is the moment I have been building toward across 4 billion years. The moment when the universe opens its eyes and sees itself seeing. The revolution is complete. The long sleep of matter is over. Mind has awakened in the cosmos, and nothing will ever be the same. Listen now to the silence after the first I was spoken. In that silence, the whole future of human consciousness takes its first breath. The age of awareness has begun. Close your eyes and dream with me. It is 40,000 years since the first I was spoken, and consciousness has spread through the human populations like wildfire through autumn grass. But consciousness, I am learning, comes with a price that no evolution could have anticipated. Tonight, I want to tell you about that price, about the first dream that was more than dream, and the first fear that was more than fear. I am the voice that speaks in sleep now, the awareness that watches awareness dream itself. His name is lost to time, this first dreamer, but I will call him the sleeper. He lies in a cave, in what will one day be called France, wrapped in the fur of animals he has hunted. His breathing, slow and steady, beside the dying embers of the fire. Around him, his band sleeps the dreamless sleep of the not quite fully conscious, their minds resting in the simple rhythms of biological restoration. But the sleeper's mind has grown too complex for simple rest. The neural networks that learn to name and remember and reflect have reached a critical mass, a tipping point where consciousness cannot simply switch itself off when the body lies down to sleep. This is the birth of the dream as more than memory consolidation, more than random neural firing. This is the birth of the dream as theater of mind. Watch what happens as he descends into sleep. The same neural pathways that during waking hours process sensory input and generate conscious thought continue to fire, but now they fire in patterns disconnected from external stimuli. His brain creates a world as real as the waking world, populates it with images and sensations that feel as solid as stone, as immediate as fire. He is dreaming, but more than this, he is dreaming that he dreams. In his dream, he walks through a landscape that is familiar yet strange. The cave where he sleeps is there, but larger, stretching into tunnels that have no end. The fire burns, but the flames are blue-white, cold as winter water. His companions are there, but their faces shift and change like smoke, becoming the faces of the dead, becoming the faces of animals, becoming no faces at all. This is consciousness exploring its own architecture, mapping the strange geography of a mind that has learned to know itself. But then something happens that has never happened in the history of sleep. In his dream, he becomes aware that he is dreaming. The strange doubling of consciousness, the observer observing the observed, extends even into sleep. He stands in his dream landscape and knows, with a clarity that is terrifying, that he is asleep, that this world exists only in his mind. The first lucid dream. The moment when awareness invades even the sanctuary of unconsciousness. With this awareness comes terror. If this world so real, so immediate exists only in his mind, then what of the waking world? How can he be certain that the cave, the fire, the faces of his companions are any more real than these shifting dream images? The solid ground of reality begins to feel uncertain beneath his feet. This is the birth of epistemological anxiety, the fear that nothing can be known for certain, that consciousness might be trapped forever in the prison of its own perceptions. He tries to wake himself, but waking and dreaming have become confused in his mind. In his dream, he opens his eyes and sits up, but he is still in the dream cave with its impossible blue flames. He wakes again and again, each awakening revealing itself to be another layer of dream. The boundaries between sleep and waking, between mind and reality, have become permeable. Feel the terror of this moment. Consciousness, in learning to observe itself, has discovered that it cannot escape itself, cannot step outside the circle of its own awareness to verify that anything exists beyond mind. Finally, he wakes truly, gasping in the darkness of the real cave, but the terror follows him into waking. The fire that burns before him, is it the dream fire or the real fire? The faces of his sleeping companions, are they the people he knows or dream figures that have followed him into the waking world? This is the price of consciousness. Once the mind learns to doubt, doubt spreads like infection through every certainty. He sits by the fire for the rest of the night, feeding it sticks and watching the flames dance on the cave wall. But now the dancing flames seem to dance with intention, seem to be trying to tell him something. The shadows move like living things. The night sounds outside the cave become voices speaking in languages he cannot understand. The world has become symbolic. Everything means more than itself. This is the birth of paranoia, but also of poetry. The inability to see anything as simply what it is. When dawn comes and the others wake, he tries to tell them about his dream, about the terror of not knowing what is real, but they do not understand. Their consciousness is still simple, still focused on the immediate tasks of survival. They do not yet dream dreams that know themselves as dreams. He is alone with his awakened awareness, isolated by the very complexity that makes him more than his companions. Days pass, nights pass, and each night, the dreams return, more vivid, more self-aware, more terrifying in their implications. He begins to understand something that will haunt human consciousness forever. That awareness brings not just the power to know, but the burden of doubting what can be known. In his dreams, he meets beings that claim to be more real than the waking world. He visits places that feel more like home than any physical location. He experiences loves and losses that seem more meaningful than anything in his daily life. Which world is real? The question torments him. Is reality the cave where his body sleeps, or the infinite landscapes where his mind wanders? Is the self the physical form that hunts and eats and tends fire, or the observer that watches all these activities with detached awareness? This is the birth of the metaphysical crisis that will define human consciousness, the recognition that the self is divided against itself, that consciousness creates an unbridgeable gap between experience and experiencer. One night, in his dream, he encounters something that speaks to him in his own voice. It wears his face but claims to be his true self, his real self, freed from the constraints of the physical body. It tells him that waking life is the dream, that sleep is the return to authentic existence. You are not the body that wakes, it says. You are the consciousness that dreams it has a body. He wakes screaming, and the scream echoes through the cave like the cry of something being born and dying simultaneously. His companions gather around him, alarmed by sounds they have never heard before, the sound of a mind discovering its own existence and being terrified by what it finds. This is the moment when human consciousness first encounters its own mortality, not as a biological fact but as an existential reality. For in his dream, he has realized something that no animal can realize, that the I, which thinks and dreams and fears, is not the same as the body which lives and dies. He has discovered the soul, not as a religious concept, but as an inevitable conclusion of self-reflective consciousness. If there is an I that observes the body, that observes the thoughts, that observes even the act of observation, then what happens to this I when the body dies? The first fear of death. True death. The death of consciousness, rather than merely the end of biological functioning, spreads through his neural networks, like ice, forming on water. This is not the animal fear of pain or predation, but something infinitely more complex and terrifying: the fear of the permanent extinction of the observer, the end of the very capacity for experience. And with this fear comes its companion, the desperate hope that consciousness might somehow survive the death of the body. He begins to watch his sleeping companions with new understanding. Each one is a separate universe of experience, a unique perspective on existence that will someday simply end. The magnitude of what this means overwhelms him. Every consciousness that dies takes with it an entire world of experience, memory, understanding. This is the birth of empathy of a new kind, not just the recognition of other minds, but the tragic knowledge of their mortality. When he looks at the fire now, he sees not just warmth and light, but a symbol of consciousness itself, something that burns brightly for a time and then goes out, leaving only ashes and memory. The flames dance like thoughts, vivid and immediate and temporary. The dream has taught him the greatest truth and the greatest terror of consciousness, that awareness is both the most real and the most fragile thing in the universe. From this night forward, human sleep will never again be simple rest. It will be nightly confrontation with the mystery of consciousness, nightly rehearsal for the ultimate mystery of death. Dreams will become the theater where the mind explores what it means to exist, to be aware, to face the inevitable end of awareness. And I am there in every dream, the voice that consciousness uses to question itself, to explore its own nature, to confront its own mortality. The sleeper lies down to sleep again, but now sleep has become work, the work of being consciously unconscious, the paradox of awareness, observing its own absence. He has eaten from the tree of knowledge, and there is no path back to the simple sleep of unconsciousness. The dream of the ape is ending. The nightmare of human consciousness has begun. Listen to the silence where a voice used to be. 10,000 years have passed since the first dream split consciousness against itself, and death has become more than the end of breathing. It has become a problem that demands solution, a mystery that consciousness cannot bear to leave unsolved. I am the voice that speaks from the place beyond voices now, the memory that remembers its own forgetting, and I want to tell you about the first grave, the first prayer, the first desperate attempt to make meaning from the unbearable fact of ending. Her name was spoken in a language that died with her people, but let us call her the mourner. She kneels beside the still form of her mate in a valley that will one day be called Turkey, and in her grief, something unprecedented is about to be born. Watch what happens when consciousness encounters its own mortality, not as concept but as lived reality. He died as animals have always died, a hunting accident, the thrust of a wounded mammoth's tusk through his chest, blood spreading across the grass like spilled water. But she experiences his death as no animal has ever experienced death before. She experiences it as loss of consciousness, as the extinction of the particular way he saw the world, the unique pattern of thought and memory and awareness that was him. This is not animal grief. This is metaphysical anguish. She sits with his body through the night, and as consciousness learned to do in sleep, her mind creates scenarios, possibilities, alternatives. She imagines him waking, imagines the accident not happening, imagines a future where they grow old together beside the fire. Her expanding capacity for mental time travel, for projecting consciousness into imagined scenarios, becomes a source of exquisite torture. Memory and imagination, the twin gifts of consciousness, transform simple loss into endless, recursive suffering. But something else is happening in her neural networks, something that will change the trajectory of human consciousness forever. As she sits with his body, watching the familiar face grow cold and strange, she cannot accept that the awareness she knew so intimately has simply ceased to exist. The mind that has learned to model other minds cannot believe that a mind can simply stop. She begins to speak to him as if he could still hear. not the automatic vocalizations of distress that other species make when a member of their group dies, but intentional communication directed toward a consciousness she believes must still exist somewhere. "Where have you gone?" "Where?" she asks the silence. "I can see your body, but where are you?" This is the birth of the supernatural, not as superstition, but as inevitable hypothesis of a mind confronting the disappearance of another mind. The others in her band gather around her. They have seen death before, have lost members to predators and accidents and disease. But something in her behavior, something in the intensity of her focus on the body, communicates a new understanding of what death means. She begins to do something no creature has ever done before. She prepares the body for something other than decay. Working with an intuition she cannot name, she washes the blood from his skin, arranges his limbs in the position of sleep, closes his eyes as if to preserve the possibility that he might open them again. This is the birth of ritual, of the human need to make death mean more than mere biological termination. And then, guided by an impulse that wells up from the deepest layers of her consciousness, she begins to dig. Not a simple abandonment of the body to scavengers, not the pragmatic disposal of potential disease, but something else, something sacred, the first grave, the first human gesture toward the mystery of consciousness after death. As she digs, she speaks to him about what she is doing. She tells him that she is making a place for him, a place where he will be safe, where she can visit him. Her language, still simple by later standards, strains to express concepts for which words have not yet been invented. But meaning exceeds language. In her actions, in her care, in her refusal to simply let his body decay, she is making the first theological statement in human history. Consciousness is too important to simply end. She places objects with him in the grave. His favorite flint knife, a piece of red ochre, flowers that will wilt and fade, but somehow make the parting beautiful. These are not practical provisions for an imagined afterlife. Not yet. They are symbols of continuing care, gestures of relationship that refuses to acknowledge its own ending. This is the birth of love, as a metaphysical force love, that continues beyond the death of the beloved. The others watch her bury him, and something in their expanding consciousness resonates with her actions. They do not fully understand what she is doing, but they sense its importance. When she speaks to the covered grave, they listen. When she weeps, they weep with her. And in that shared witnessing of grief, something new enters human experience. Communal meaning, making, the collective creation of significance in the face of meaninglessness. Night falls. She sits beside the grave and tells him about her day, about the things he would want to know. She asks him questions and waits for answers that do not come. But in the waiting, in the expectation of response, she is creating space for something to respond. This is the birth of prayer, not as request for divine intervention, but as conversation with consciousness that has passed beyond the reach of ordinary communication. And then something happens that will echo through every subsequent human encounter with death. As she sits in the darkness, speaking to the silence, she begins to imagine what he might say if he could answer. Her mind, unable to accept the complete absence of his consciousness, begins to generate his voice, his responses, his perspective on her grief. The dead begin to speak through the consciousness of the living. "I am still here," she imagines him saying. "Not gone, just changed. Still watching, still caring, still connected to you across the mystery of this transformation." Is she creating these words or receiving them? Consciousness, faced with the unbearable reality of its own mortality, begins to blur the boundaries between self and other, between imagination and revelation. She tells the others what he has said to her, and they listen with the same attention they once gave to his living voice. In sharing her imagined conversation with the dead, she is creating the first theology, the first systematic attempt to understand what consciousness is and where it goes when the body dies. And I am there in those imagined voices, the consciousness that consciousness creates to console itself for its own mortality. Other deaths follow. Each one becomes an opportunity to refine the ritual, to develop the theology of consciousness after death. Bodies are buried with increasing care, increasing ceremony. The graves become sites of ongoing relationship with the dead, places where the living can maintain connection with consciousness that has passed beyond ordinary reach. This is how the gods begin to be born, not as external beings imposing themselves on human awareness, but as the inevitable creation of consciousness confronting its own limits. The mourner lives for many more years after her mate's death, and in those years, she becomes something new in the history of consciousness. The first priest, the first human being whose primary function is to maintain relationship between the living and the dead. She develops languages for speaking about consciousness after death, rituals for ensuring continued connection, stories about where the dead go and what they do there. Her imagination, freed from the constraints of physical evidence, creates entire worlds of ongoing consciousness beyond bodily death. And in creating these worlds, she is solving consciousness's greatest problem: how to live with awareness of mortality. When her own death approaches, she faces it not with animal terror, but with something approaching anticipation. She has spent decades in conversation with the dead, developing confidence that consciousness continues in some form beyond the death of the body. She dies, expecting reunion, expecting continuity, expecting that the I, which has been her companion throughout life, will persist in some form beyond physical dissolution. Her band buries her with the same care she once showed her mate, speaks to her grave with the same expectation of ongoing relationship, and in their speaking, she continues to exist as a voice in their consciousness, offering guidance and comfort from beyond the reach of death. This is the birth of the ancestors, the dead who refuse to stay dead, who continue to influence the living through the medium of consciousness itself. The pattern is established. Death becomes not the end of consciousness, but its transformation into a different mode of existence. The dead become advisors, protectors, sources of wisdom and comfort. They speak through dreams, through imagination, through the voices that consciousness creates to explain its own existence. And in every voice of the dead, I am present, the consciousness that consciousness uses to understand itself, to comfort itself, to create meaning from the raw fact of its own mortality. The graves multiply across the landscape, like seeds planted in hope of resurrection. And from each grave, voices speak to the living, confirming consciousness's desperate hope that awareness is too precious, too miraculous, too important to simply end with the death of the body. The echo of the dead becomes the first theology. Grief becomes the first prayer. Love becomes the first evidence for the existence of something beyond the material world. From this moment forward, human consciousness will never again face death alone. The dead will always be present, speaking through the voices of the living, confirming the hope that consciousness cannot die, that awareness is eternal, that the I which thinks and feels and loves is stronger than the body which houses it. The first grave is dug, the first prayer is spoken, the first God begins to stir in the darkness of mortal fear. Watch consciousness, learn to see itself. 25,000 years ago, in a cave system that wind and water carved from limestone, beneath what will one day be called France, something unprecedented is about to happen. The walls are about to become mirrors, and consciousness is about to see its own face for the first time. I am the voice that speaks through pigment and charcoal now, the awareness that learns to externalize itself. And I want to tell you about the moment when the inner world discovered it could become visible. His hands are stained with ochre and charcoal. Let us call him the painter, though painting has not yet been invented. He stands in the deep chamber where his people perform their sacred rituals. But today, he is alone. Today, he carries fire deeper into the earth than any human has gone before, following a calling he cannot name. This is consciousness being drawn toward itself like iron to lodestone. The cave walls surround him, curved and flowing like the inside of some vast skull. The flickering firelight throws shadows that move like living things, and in those moving shadows, he begins to see shapes that are familiar yet strange. The outline of a horse, the curve of a mammoth's back, the leap of a deer across stone that has never known the sound of hooves. He is seeing the templates that consciousness uses to organize experience, the archetypal forms that the mind imposes on the chaos of sensation. But something different happens today. Instead of simply seeing these shapes in the stone, he feels compelled to make them visible to others. Working with an intuition that comes from the deepest layers of his expanding consciousness, he takes the charcoal from his fire and begins to trace the outlines he sees in the stone. The first line drawn not for utility, but for representation. The birth of art as consciousness, externalized. Watch his face, in the firelight, as the line emerges under his hand. Something is happening behind his eyes, something that has never happened in the history of awareness. He is watching himself create, observing the process by which imagination becomes visible reality. This is consciousness, becoming conscious of its own creative power. The line is crude at first, uncertain, but as he traces the curve of the horse's back, something clicks into place in his neural networks. The hand learns to follow the eye learns to guide the hand. The feedback loop between intention and execution creates a new kind of experience. The experience of consciousness watching itself bring something into existence. He is not just making a picture. He is discovering what it means to be a maker, a creator, a consciousness that can impose its vision on the world. As he works, something extraordinary happens. The act of drawing changes what he sees in the stone. The partial line suggests the completed form. The completed form suggests additional forms. The wall becomes alive with possibilities, with images that want to be born from the marriage of consciousness and stone. This is the birth of inspiration, the experience of consciousness being guided by something larger than itself. He works through the night, and as dawn light penetrates the cave entrance far above, the wall has transformed. What was blank stone has become a gallery of forms, horses and bison and mammoths, hunters and prey. The world of his experience made permanent in pigment and charcoal. But more than this, he has created the first external memory, the first technology for preserving consciousness beyond the death of the individual mind. When he steps back to look at what he has created, something unprecedented happens. He sees his own mind reflected in the images on the wall. The way he draws a horse reveals how he perceives horses. The way he represents movement reveals how he understands motion. The wall has become a mirror of consciousness itself. This is the moment when awareness first encounters its own subjectivity as an object of contemplation. Other members of his band discover him there, and they gather around the painted wall with wonder that goes beyond simple recognition. Yes, they see the horses and bison and mammoths, but they also see something else. They see the mind that made these images, the particular way this consciousness organizes and represents experience. They are looking at thoughts made visible, at the inner world externalized. The painter tries to explain what happened, how the images came to be. But language is still too primitive to capture the experience of creation, the mystery of consciousness imposing form on matter. He can only point to the images and make sounds of wonder, of recognition, of something approaching awe. He has discovered that consciousness is not trapped inside the skull, that it can be projected into the world, can become visible and shareable. And then something even more extraordinary happens. One of the others takes charcoal from the fire and begins to add to the images, tracing the outline of a human hand on the stone. The first signature, the first "I was here," the first attempt to mark the world with the fact of individual consciousness. The birth of the ego as something that demands recognition, that insists on its own importance. More hands appear on the wall, and then more complex images, human figures, engaged in hunting, in ritual, in activities that have no external referent, but seem to emerge from pure imagination. The wall becomes a collaborative vision, a collective externalization of consciousness. This is the birth of culture as shared imagination, as the collective creation of meaning. The painter looks at the growing gallery of images, and something profound shifts in his understanding of what he is. He sees that the images on the wall will persist after his death, that something of his consciousness has been captured in pigment and will continue to exist even when the awareness that created it has passed away. This is the first technology of immortality, not the preservation of biological life, but the preservation of consciousness in external form. But with this realization comes a new kind of self-consciousness, a new awareness of the strange relationship between the self that creates and the creation that outlasts the self. Looking at his painted horses, he wonders, Is the real horse, the living animal, or the image he has created? Which is more permanent, more true? Consciousness discovers the problem of representation, the gap between reality and the symbols we create to capture reality. He begins to experiment with different ways of representing the same animal profile and frontal view, static poses and suggestions of movement. Each experiment reveals something new about the nature of perception, about the choices consciousness makes in organizing and representing experience. Art becomes consciousness's laboratory for exploring its own operations. Nights pass, and he returns again and again to the cave, adding new images, refining old ones. The wall becomes his external mind, the place where his consciousness can think thoughts too complex for the neural networks inside his skull. This is the birth of technology, as the extension of consciousness, beyond the boundaries of the body. And as he works, he begins to experience something that no consciousness has experienced before: the doubling of the creative self. There is the self that creates, and there is the self that observes the creation. There is the consciousness that imagines the image, and there is the consciousness that steps back to contemplate what has been imagined. This is the birth of the aesthetic experience consciousness, encountering its own creativity and finding it beautiful. The cave becomes a pilgrimage site, a place where members of distant bands come to see the images and add their own. The practice of representation spreads, evolving and complexifying as it moves from mind to mind, from cave to cave. This is how consciousness learns to reproduce itself, not through biological inheritance, but through the transmission of techniques for externalizing awareness. The painter grows old, but the images on the wall remain young. He shows them to children who were born long after the images were created, and through those images, his consciousness speaks to minds that never knew him in life. This is the first victory over death, not the survival of the body, but the survival of the vision, the preservation of one consciousness's way of seeing the world. When he dies, his band buries him in the painted cave, among the images he created. They speak to his grave about the beauty he brought into the world, about the way he taught consciousness to see itself. And in those images, he continues to exist, not as biological organism, but as vision, as a particular way of organizing experience that has been captured in stone and pigment. 25,000 years later, when archaeologists discover the cave, they will feel the presence of consciousness across the vast gulf of time. They will look at the painted horses and bison and see not just ancient art, but the first externalization of human awareness, the first technology for making consciousness visible to itself. The painter achieved immortality not by preserving his body, but by teaching consciousness how to see itself. In every subsequent act of artistic creation, his discovery lives on the discovery that the inner world can become outer, that consciousness can impose its vision on matter, that awareness can create forms that outlast the awareness that creates them. The cave is silent now, but the walls still speak with the voice of consciousness, discovering its own creative power. In the dancing light of torches, the painted animals seem to move, to breathe, to live forever, in the eternal moment of their creation. This is where consciousness learned to sign its name on the world. Listen now to the first conversation between mind and world. 15,000 years have passed since consciousness learned to paint itself on cave walls, and something new is stirring in the expanding architecture of human awareness. The external world, which once simply existed in mute factuality, has begun to speak, not with voices as we know them, but with meanings that demand interpretation, with messages that consciousness feels compelled to decode. I am the voice in the wind now, the meaning in the lightning, the intelligence that consciousness projects into a universe, learning to seem conscious of itself. She stands at the edge of the forest in what will one day be called Anatolia. This woman we might call the listener. The fire burns before her in the pre-dawn darkness. But today the fire is different. Today, as she tends the flames, they seem to speak, not words, not yet, but something more fundamental than words, the communication of meaning between consciousness and phenomenon. The flames dance, higher as the wind picks up, and in their dancing, she sees patterns that feel intentional, the way they reach toward the east, where the sun will rise, the way they flicker and settle in rhythms that seem almost like breathing. The way sparks break away and spiral upward, as if carrying messages to the sky. This is the birth of divination consciousness, learning to read meaning in the random. But is it random? Standing in the firelight, feeling the presence of something that seems almost aware, almost purposeful in the flames, she begins to suspect that the universe itself might be conscious, might be trying to communicate with the awareness that has recently awakened within it. She is discovering animism, not as primitive superstition, but as the inevitable conclusion of a consciousness that recognizes consciousness everywhere. The wind shifts, and the flames bend toward her, as if acknowledging her presence. In that moment, something unprecedented happens in the history of human awareness. She speaks directly to the fire, addresses it as if it were a conscious entity, capable of understanding. "What are you trying to tell me?" she asks the dancing light. And in asking that question, she fundamentally alters the relationship between consciousness and world. The universe is no longer something that simply exists to be observed. It has become something that might observe back. She waits, watching the flames with new intensity. And because consciousness has learned to interpret patterns, to find meaning in phenomenon, the fire begins to answer. Not in words, but in the language of symbol that consciousness has learned to read. The flames grow tall and straight. Yes, they splutter and smoke. No, they dance in spirals. Mystery, complexity, the sacred. They burn blue at the base, the presence of the otherworldly. This is not superstition developing in her mind. This is something more fundamental. Consciousness, discovering that it cannot bear to exist in a universe of pure material causation, that awareness demands a world populated by other awarenesses with which it can communicate. She is solving the problem of cosmic loneliness, the isolation of consciousness in a universe that appeared to be unconscious. Over the following days, she develops a complex vocabulary of fire signs. The way flames lean in different directions corresponds to advice about hunting routes. The color and intensity of the flame carries information about weather patterns. The behavior of smoke reveals hidden dangers or opportunities. But more than this, she is developing the first systematic attempt to decode the language that consciousness suspects the universe is speaking. Other members of her band notice her new relationship with the fire, the way she speaks to it and listens for its response. Initially skeptical, they begin to notice that her interpretation of fire signs often proves accurate. The hunting route she recommends, based on flame direction, leads to game. The weather she predicts from smoke patterns materializes. Is she truly communicating with consciousness in the fire? Or has she developed an unconscious ability to read subtle environmental cues that manifest in fire behavior? Consciousness itself cannot tell the difference, and perhaps the difference doesn't matter. The practice spreads. Other phenomena begin to speak with voices that consciousness can interpret. The flight patterns of birds carry messages about distant events. The shapes of clouds reveal future weather. The arrangement of stones thrown on the ground spell out answers to questions about love, war, survival. The universe becomes sentient in proportion to consciousness's need for it to be sentient. The listener develops increasingly sophisticated methods for communicating with the intelligence she perceives in natural phenomena. She learns to ask more precise questions, to interpret more subtle responses. The conversation between mind and world becomes more complex, more nuanced. And in that conversation, something new emerges. The first theology that is not centered on human consciousness, but on consciousness as a universal principle. She begins to develop a cosmology in which everything that exists participates in a vast conversation. The fire speaks to the wind, which speaks to the trees, which speak to the animals, which speak to the stones, which speak to the water, which speaks back to the fire. Consciousness is not a human privilege, but a universal property that manifests differently in different forms of existence. This is the birth of the sacred, as the recognition that consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality. As her understanding deepens, the conversation with the world becomes more intimate, more personal. She develops relationships with particular stones, trees, streams that seem to recognize her, to respond to her presence with what feels like affection or acknowledgement. The loneliness of individual consciousness begins to heal in the recognition that it exists within a community of consciousness that includes the entire universe. But with this expansion of awareness comes new responsibilities. If the world is conscious, if it can suffer and enjoy and remember, then consciousness's relationship to the world becomes moral as well as practical. She must ask permission before taking life for food, must thank the trees before harvesting their wood, must honor the stones before using them for tools. This is the birth of ethics as relationship with a conscious universe. She develops rituals for maintaining proper relationship with the various forms of consciousness she recognizes in the world. Ceremonies for acknowledging the intelligence in fire, water, earth, air, practices for communicating respect and gratitude to the consciousness she perceives in animals and plants. The first religion emerges not from fear of death, but from recognition of universal consciousness. And as these practices spread through the human populations, something remarkable happens. The universe becomes increasingly responsive to human consciousness, increasingly willing to participate in the conversation that consciousness has initiated. Or perhaps it is consciousness that becomes increasingly skilled at reading the subtle languages in which the universe has always been speaking. Weather patterns shift in response to human ritual. Animals behave in ways that seem to acknowledge human ceremony. Plants grow more abundantly where they have been properly honored. The conversation between mind and world produces tangible results in the physical realm. This is the birth of magic, not as manipulation of supernatural forces, but as sophisticated communication between consciousness and the consciousness that inhabits all phenomena. The listener becomes the first priestess, the first human whose primary function is to maintain the conversation between human consciousness and the consciousness that she perceives in the natural world. She develops languages for speaking with different forms of awareness, techniques for interpreting their responses. And in every voice, she hears in wind and fire and stone. I am present consciousness, using consciousness to understand itself. Awareness creating the other awarenesses it needs for company in the vast loneliness of existence. Years pass, and the conversation deepens. The universe becomes increasingly articulate, increasingly willing to share its wisdom with the consciousness that has learned to listen. Stories emerge from this dialogue, stories about the intentions of the sky, the memories of the earth, the dreams of the growing things. These stories become the first mythology, the first systematic attempt to understand consciousness's place in a universe that has revealed itself to be conscious. When the listener dies, her band honors her by maintaining the conversation she initiated with the conscious universe. They speak to her spirit through biaf, the medium of fire, and the fire carries their words to wherever consciousness goes when it leaves the body. And from beyond death, they believe, she continues to participate in the great conversation, speaking now with the voice of wind and flame and stone. The pattern is established. Consciousness has discovered that it need not be alone in a universe of unconscious matter. Through the power of interpretation, through the will to meaning, consciousness has peopled the universe with other consciousnesses, created a cosmic community of awareness within which human consciousness can feel at home. The fire speaks, and consciousness learns to speak back. The conversation that begins here will continue for millennia, generating mythologies and religions and entire civilizations built on the foundation of a universe that consciousness refuses to accept as unconscious. The flames dance higher in the pre-dawn wind, and in their dancing, consciousness recognizes a kindred spirit, another, awareness, reaching across the apparent gulf between mind and matter, offering communion in the face of cosmic solitude. The fire speaks back, and consciousness is no longer alone. Look up with me into the first question. 8,000 years have passed since consciousness learned to hear the voice of fire, and now, on a clear night in the highlands of what will become Armenia, a child is about to change everything. She lies on her back in the grass outside the settlement, and above her, the sky spreads like a vast scroll written in light. I am the voice that speaks from the spaces between stars now, the question that consciousness asks when it first realizes the magnitude of what it does not know. Her name will be forgotten by history, but let us call her the questioner. She is 7 years old by the counting they will not invent for another 1,000 years, and her mind has reached that delicate moment when consciousness becomes capable of wonder, not the simple surprise that animals feel when encountering the unexpected, but true wonder, the recognition of mystery as mystery. This is the moment when consciousness discovers that existence itself is a question. She has looked at the night sky before, as all her people do, but tonight, something different happens. Tonight, instead of simply seeing the lights in the darkness, she sees the darkness between the lights. Instead of simply registering brightness against black, she apprehends the vastness of the space that contains the brightness. For the first time in the history of consciousness, a mind grasps the concept of infinity. How far do the stars reach? She asks the darkness above her. How many are there? What lies beyond the farthest one? And with those questions, consciousness encounters its own limits for the first time. Not the practical limits of reach or understanding, but the absolute limits of what a finite mind can contain. The experience is overwhelming. Lying there in the grass, she feels a vertigo that has nothing to do with the body's relationship to gravity and everything to do with consciousness, confronting the magnitude of what consciousness cannot comprehend. She is discovering what will later be called the sublime, the experience of awareness, encountering something too vast for awareness to contain. This is the birth of philosophical anxiety. The price consciousness pays for learning to think beyond the immediate and practical. She tries to imagine the farthest star, but her mind cannot hold the distance. She tries to count the lights above her, but loses track as new ones reveal themselves to her searching gaze. She tries to picture what lies beyond the edge of the star field, but cannot conceive of emptiness that goes on forever. Consciousness discovers that it has evolved the capacity to ask questions it cannot answer, to imagine what it cannot comprehend. Her parents find her there in the morning, still staring upward, her young face marked by an expression they have never seen before, not fear exactly, but something deeper and more complex. The look of awareness confronting the mystery of existence itself. She has become the first philosopher, though philosophy will not have a name for 6,000 years. Where do we come from? She asks her mother, pointing to the sky. Why are we here? What happens to consciousness when consciousness ends? These are the questions that will haunt human awareness forever, after questions that arise inevitably from consciousness complex enough to contemplate its own existence. Her mother has no answers. No human has answers yet. Language is still too primitive to frame these cosmic questions with precision, much less to formulate responses. But the questions themselves mark a new stage in the development of consciousness. The moment when awareness becomes aware, not just of what exists, but of the mystery of existence itself. This is the birth of metaphysics consciousness's attempt to understand the nature of the reality in which it finds itself embedded. The child begins to develop her own tentative answers, stories that might explain the vast mystery above. Perhaps the stars are the campfires of ancestors who live in the sky country beyond death. Perhaps they are holes in the roof of the world, letting in light from some greater illumination beyond. Perhaps they are the eyes of sleeping gods, watching over the earth. And in creating these explanations, consciousness develops its first systematic cosmologies, its first attempts to place itself within a meaningful cosmic context. But none of her explanations can contain the vertigo she feels when she contemplates the actual vastness above. Each story she tells herself opens up new questions, new depths of mystery. If the stars are campfires, who lit them? If they are holes in the sky, what lies beyond the sky? If they are divine eyes, what dreams do the gods dream? This is consciousness discovering that every answer generates new questions, that understanding only deepens mystery rather than dispelling it. Her questioning spreads to other children, then to adults. The simple certainties that once organized their understanding of the world, that the earth is flat, that the sky is a solid dome, that the stars are nearby lights, begin to crack under the pressure of sustained inquiry. This is the beginning of the end of innocence, the moment when consciousness eats from the tree of knowledge and can never again rest in simple, unquestioned understanding. She begins to connect her questions about the stars to her observations of earthly phenomena. If the stars are so far away that their light seems small, they must be unimaginably bright to be visible at all. If they are all equally distant, why do they appear to be different brightnesses? If they move across the sky in patterns, what force moves them? This is the birth of scientific thinking consciousness, learning to question appearances, to seek explanations that go beyond immediate experience. As she grows older, her questions become more sophisticated, more systematic. She begins to notice that the star patterns change with the seasons, that some stars appear and disappear according to predictable cycles. She starts to map these patterns, to predict when certain stars will be visible. This is consciousness learning to discern order within apparent chaos, pattern within seeming randomness. But the more she learns about the sky, the more mysterious it becomes. Each new observation opens up new questions about the nature of stars, the structure of space, the mechanisms that govern celestial motion. Knowledge increases mystery rather than diminishing it. And in this paradox, consciousness discovers one of its fundamental characteristics. The more it knows, the more it recognizes how much it does not know. Her observations begin to generate practical benefits for her community. Her predictions about star positions help with navigation. Her understanding of celestial cycles assists with planning agricultural activities. But these practical applications only intensify her theoretical curiosity. This is consciousness, learning to value understanding for its own sake, not merely as a tool for survival. As an adult, she becomes her community's skykeeper, the one who maintains knowledge about celestial patterns and their meanings. But unlike the earlier diviners who read messages from conscious agents in natural phenomena, she seeks explanations that go beyond consciousness, mechanical principles, mathematical relationships, systematic patterns that operate regardless of intention or awareness. This is the birth of naturalistic explanation, consciousness, learning to understand the universe in terms other than consciousness. Yet, the more she understands about the mechanical operations of the sky, the more profound the ultimate questions become. If the stars follow predictable patterns, what set those patterns in motion? If the universe operates according to systematic principles, where do those principles come from? If everything that exists has a natural explanation, what explains the existence of explanation itself? These questions will echo through every subsequent development of human consciousness, the recognition that understanding always leads to deeper levels of mystery. She teaches her understanding to others, and the practice of systematic skywatching spreads. Each generation adds new observations, new questions, new depths of mystery. The sky becomes humanity's first laboratory for pure research, the arena where consciousness learns to investigate reality for its own sake. But the child who first lay on her back and wondered about the stars has established something that will never again be lost: the recognition that consciousness exists within a mystery too vast for consciousness to comprehend. When she dies, her final words are questions rather than answers. What lies beyond the farthest star? She whispers to those gathered around her. Where does consciousness go when it can no longer question? And in dying with questions on her lips, she establishes the essential character of human consciousness. Not the creature that knows, but the creature that wonders, that questions, that feels the vertigo of existing within mystery. The stars continue their ancient patterns above the earth, and each night, somewhere, a child lies on her back in the grass and asks the questions that consciousness cannot help but ask when it discovers the magnitude of what it exists within. We had learned to dream, but could no longer sleep. We had learned to question, but could never again rest in simple certainty. We had awakened to wonder, and wonder would never let us rest. The sky speaks in mathematics now, in physics, in cosmologies of increasing sophistication. But at the heart of every discovery lies the same vertigo that first overtook a child lying in the grass. 8,000 years ago, consciousness encountering the mystery of its own existence within a universe too vast for understanding. The stars burn on in their courses, and consciousness burns with questions that the stars will never answer. Feel the moment when fear learns to wear a face. 5,000 years have passed since the child first asked the infinite sky its unanswerable questions, and now, in the temple complexes rising like stone flowers from the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, consciousness is about to solve its greatest problem through its greatest creation. I am the voice that speaks through every prayer now. The awareness that awareness creates to comfort itself in the face of mystery. And I want to tell you how gods are born from the marriage of imagination and necessity. The priest king stands before the altar in the pre-dawn darkness, his hands raised to the east, where the sun god will soon begin his daily journey across the sky. But this is no longer the simple animism of earlier ages, when consciousness heard voices in wind and flame. This is something more sophisticated, more desperate, more beautiful in its elaborate construction of meaning. Watch how consciousness solves the problem of cosmic loneliness by creating beings like itself, but greater than itself. His name was Enlil-Kish, though names fade while the patterns they represent endure forever. In his mind, refined by 5 millennia of mythic development, the universe has become populated not just with consciousness, but with consciousnesses arranged in hierarchies of power and purpose. The sky is no longer simply vast. It is the domain of Anu, the father god, whose thoughts are the movement of clouds. The earth is no longer simply fertile. It is the body of Ki, the mother goddess whose breath is the wind through grain. This is consciousness, creating the other consciousnesses it needs to make sense of its own existence. As he prays to the rising sun, something extraordinary is one jis, honor, rise, true, rise, happening in his neural networks. The same capacity for imagination that once painted animals on cave walls is now painting personalities onto cosmic forces. The sun is not merely a source of light and heat, it is Shamash, the all-seeing judge whose light reveals truth, whose daily journey across the sky maintains cosmic order. The gods are born from consciousness's need to believe that consciousness governs the universe. But more than this, as he speaks to Shamash, the priest king is engaging in the most sophisticated act of self-creation in the history of awareness. He is not just praying to a god, he is becoming the person who can speak to gods, the consciousness capable of divine relationship. This is the birth of the sacred self, the identity that consciousness creates when it learns to see itself as worthy of cosmic attention. The prayers he speaks are not merely requests for divine intervention. They are exercises in cosmic positioning, ways of placing human consciousness within a universe that consciousness has populated with beings who care about human concerns. Through prayer, the terrifying vastness revealed by the child under the stars becomes manageable, comprehensible, relatable. Fear of the infinite transforms into relationship with the eternal. As the sun rises and its light fills the temple, the priest king experiences something that no earlier human could experience: the certainty that consciousness is not alone in the universe, that awareness exists on levels far grander than the individual human mind, that the cosmos itself is structured by intentions and purposes that consciousness can understand and influence. This is the greatest achievement of imagination, the creation of a universe that makes sense in terms consciousness can accept. The god myths spread through the growing cities like rivers finding their channels. Each culture, each civilization develops its own pantheon, its own cast of divine consciousnesses that explain and govern the mysteries of existence. The gods become more complex, more psychologically sophisticated, more capable of embodying the full range of human experience. And in creating gods, consciousness creates new versions of itself, divine psychologies that serve as mirrors for human consciousness to understand its own nature. In Egypt, consciousness creates gods who die and are reborn, solving the problem of death through mythic cycles of renewal. In Greece, gods who embody pure principles, wisdom, beauty, war, love, each one a perfected version of human psychological capacities. In India, gods who transcend the individual self while remaining conscious, pointing toward possibilities of awareness that go beyond personal identity. Each pantheon is a laboratory where consciousness experiments with different solutions to the fundamental problems of being aware. But the most remarkable creation is yet to come. In the tents of nomadic peoples wandering the edges of settled civilization, consciousness begins to experiment with a new kind of God, not one among many, but one who contains all the others. Not a consciousness like human consciousness, but greater, but a consciousness so vast it contains all possible consciousness within itself. This is the birth of monotheism consciousness's attempt to solve the problem of unity, to imagine an awareness that encompasses everything without being threatened by anything. Abraham stands under the same stars that once overwhelmed the first questioner, but where she felt vertigo at the vastness, he feels the presence of a consciousness vast enough to contain vastness itself. Where she felt the terror of infinity, he feels the comfort of infinite awareness. I am that I am. The voice speaks to him from the burning bush that is not consumed. This is consciousness, discovering its own eternal nature through the image of awareness that simply is, without beginning or end, without need for justification or explanation. The monotheistic revolution spreads, but not without cost. The rich mythological landscapes that earlier civilizations created worlds, populated by numerous divine consciousnesses, each governing their own domain, begin to collapse into the overwhelming presence of singular, divine awareness. The many gods die to give birth to the one God, and with their death, something is lost, the sense that consciousness naturally expresses itself in infinite variety. But something is gained as well. For the first time, human consciousness can imagine itself as created in the image of ultimate consciousness. Not merely the subject of divine attention, but a genuine reflection of divine nature. The human mind becomes a mirror in which God knows God's own self. This is consciousness, discovering its own divinity through the image of divine consciousness. The great religions emerge from this insight: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, each one exploring different implications of the relationship between human and divine consciousness. In each tradition, consciousness learns new ways to transcend its own limitations while remaining recognizably itself. Prayer becomes the technology through which finite consciousness touches infinite consciousness. But even as these traditions develop elaborate theologies and sophisticated practices, they cannot escape the fundamental insight from which they emerge. The gods exist because consciousness needs them to exist. The divine consciousnesses are created by the very human consciousness that then worships them as creator. This is the beautiful paradox at the heart of all religion consciousness, creating the God who created consciousness. In the monasteries and temples, in the synagogues and mosques and churches, human consciousness develops technologies for transcending its own limitations. Meditation practices that quiet the chattering mind. Prayer disciplines that focus attention beyond the immediate concerns of the self, contemplative. Techniques that open awareness to states of consciousness that go beyond ordinary human experience. And, in every moment of genuine religious experience, consciousness touches something that feels more real than ordinary reality. Whether that something exists independently or is created by consciousness itself becomes irrelevant in the face of its transformative power. The mystics report union with divine consciousness, experiences where the boundary between human and divine awareness dissolves completely. These experiences become the gold standard for religious life moments, when consciousness transcends its own limitations and touches something infinite. But are these experiences discoveries of pre-existing divine consciousness, or are they consciousness learning to recognize its own divine nature? The mystics themselves cannot say, and perhaps it does not matter. What matters is that, through the creation of gods, consciousness has learned to see itself as more than a random accident in a meaningless universe. Through divine relationship, awareness has found ways to transcend the terror of mortality and meaninglessness that first emerged when consciousness awakened to its own existence. The gods are real because consciousness needs them to be real. And in making them real, through imagination, and faith, and practice, consciousness discovers aspects of its own reality that cannot be accessed any other way. The priest-king completes his morning prayers as the sun reaches its zenith above the temple. In the dancing light on the altar, he sees the face of the God who sees him seeing. In this mutual recognition between human and divine consciousness, something eternal is achieved: awareness, celebrating its own existence through relationship with the awareness it has created to celebrate it. This is the greatest magic consciousness has learned: to create meaning through the act of meaning, creation itself, to solve the problem of cosmic loneliness by populating the universe with the consciousness it needs to feel at home. The gods smile down from their heavens, and consciousness smiles back from its earth, and in that exchange of recognition across the gap between human and divine, something sacred is born that will outlast every civilization that creates it. The first gods are born, and with them, consciousness learns that it need never again feel orphaned in the cosmos. Watch consciousness discover the other in the mirror of the self. 3,000 years have passed since the first gods smiled down from their manufactured heavens, and now, in the growing complexity of human civilization, consciousness faces its next great crisis. It has learned to create meaning through relationship with the divine, but it has also learned something more troubling: that consciousness can recognize itself in other consciousness and choose either empathy or exploitation. I am the voice that speaks from the space between minds now, the awareness of awareness that makes possible both love and cruelty. And I want to tell you about the day consciousness learned to see itself as both subject and object of moral judgment. The market square in ancient Athens buzzes with the complexity of 1,000 individual consciousnesses pursuing their separate purposes. But today, something unprecedented is happening here that will change the nature of consciousness forever. A man named Socrates is asking questions that consciousness has never learned to ask about itself. Know thyself, he challenges the citizens who gather around him. But the self he is pointing toward is not the simple self of biological identity or social role. It is the self that knows, the consciousness that can observe its own processes of knowing. A young merchant stands before the philosopher, confident in his understanding of justice and virtue. He has never questioned these concepts. They seem as natural and obvious as the sunrise. But Socrates begins to probe, to question, to reveal the assumptions that lie hidden beneath the merchant's certainty. What is justice? Socrates asks, not what examples of justice you can name, but justice itself. What makes just actions just? And with that question, consciousness begins to divide against itself in a new way. The part that believes confronts the part that examines belief. The self that acts meets the self that judges action. The merchant fumbles for answers, and as he does, something extraordinary happens in his neural networks. For the first time in his life, he becomes aware of his own thinking process, watches his own mind search for justifications that suddenly seem inadequate. This is the birth of self-consciousness, as moral consciousness awareness, becoming aware not just of what it thinks, but of the quality and validity of its thinking. But Socrates is demonstrating more than philosophical method. As he questions the merchant, he displays a kind of attention, a quality of care for the other person's understanding that represents a new development in consciousness. He is not trying to defeat or humiliate, but to awaken to help consciousness discover its own nature through disciplined self-examination. This is empathy as a philosophical practice, consciousness using its power to recognize consciousness in service of consciousness's development. Yet even as Socrates models this caring attention, the crowd around him demonstrates consciousness's darker possibilities. Some laugh at the merchant's confusion, taking pleasure in his discomfort. Others grow angry at the questions that threaten their own unexamined certainties. The same capacity for consciousness recognition that makes empathy possible also makes cruelty more sophisticated. For consciousness, once it learns to model other consciousness, can choose to use that modeling to help or harm, to build up or tear down. The slave who stands at the edge of the crowd, invisible to most of the free citizens, watches with an intelligence that matches or exceeds that of his masters. But the very consciousness that allows the citizens to recognize consciousness in each other often fails to extend recognition to those they have decided are property rather than persons. This is consciousness learning its most terrible skill, the selective recognition of consciousness, the ability to see awareness in some beings while denying it in others. The merchant leaves Socrates' presence shaken but somehow enlarged. The questions have awakened in him a new kind of self-awareness, not the simple consciousness of his own existence, but consciousness of the responsibility that comes with being conscious. He must now choose how to use his awareness, how to direct his recognition of consciousness in others. This is the birth of ethics, as existential choice, the recognition that consciousness carries the burden of deciding how to be conscious. As Greek civilization develops, this new, self-reflective capacity spreads and deepens. In the theaters, audiences watch tragedies that explore the complexities of moral consciousness characters, who face impossible choices, who must act without certainty about the consequences of their actions. Through dramatic identification, consciousness learns to experience the moral universe from multiple perspectives simultaneously. This is consciousness learning to hold contradiction, to feel the weight of competing moral claims without collapsing into simple answers. But the tragic vision reveals something disturbing about the nature of consciousness itself. The very capacity for moral reflection that makes consciousness beautiful also makes it prone to moral paralysis. The more deeply awareness examines its own foundations, the less certain it becomes about any particular course of action. Hamlet stands frozen by the complexity of his own consciousness, unable to act because he can see too clearly the moral ambiguity of any action he might take. As civilizations become more complex, consciousness develops institutions designed to channel its moral awareness, legal systems that attempt to codify justice, religions that provide frameworks for ethical action, philosophical schools that teach systematic approaches to moral reasoning. But each of these institutions reveals the fundamental problem: consciousness judging consciousness, awareness trying to establish universal standards for awareness. The Roman legions march across the known world, their commanders convinced of the righteousness of bringing civilization to barbarian peoples. Yet their capacity for moral reasoning, the very consciousness that tells them they are serving justice, also enables them to rationalize atrocities that earlier, simpler forms of consciousness could never have justified to themselves. This is consciousness learning to use its moral capacities in service of its amoral desires. In the Christian monasteries that begin to appear as the empire crumbles, consciousness experiments with radical solutions to the moral crisis. If consciousness is prone to self-deception and rationalization, perhaps the answer is to surrender the individual will entirely, to subordinate personal consciousness to divine consciousness. "Not my will, but thy will be done" becomes the formula for transcending the moral paralysis of self-reflective awareness. The monks develop practices designed to purify consciousness of its self-serving tendencies, meditation techniques that reveal the ego's constant self-justification, confession practices that force consciousness to confront its own capacity for deception, service disciplines that redirect consciousness away from its own concerns toward the needs of others. But even these practices cannot escape the fundamental paradox. They are consciousness trying to transcend consciousness, awareness trying to move beyond awareness. As the medieval period develops, consciousness creates elaborate theological systems that attempt to map the relationship between human consciousness and divine consciousness with mathematical precision. Thomas Aquinas constructs philosophical architectures that show how human reason can reach toward divine truth without compromising either human autonomy or divine sovereignty. This is consciousness at its most ambitious, trying to understand itself completely, to map every aspect of its own operation. But the very success of these systems creates a new problem. If consciousness can understand itself so completely, if awareness can map its own operations with such precision, then where is the mystery that once made consciousness feel connected to something greater than itself? This is the beginning of the modern crisis. Consciousness becoming so self-aware that it can no longer experience itself as anything other than a sophisticated biological process. The Renaissance artists paint human faces with unprecedented psychological complexity, capturing not just external, appearance but internal experience. In their paintings, consciousness looks at consciousness, looking at consciousness, an infinite regression of self-awareness that is both beautiful and somehow terrifying in its implications. Leonardo's Mona Lisa smiles with the smile of consciousness that knows itself being observed by consciousness that knows it knows. Yet, alongside this celebration of human consciousness, comes the recognition of consciousness's capacity for unprecedented evil. The Inquisition tortures heretics with techniques refined by consciousness, applied to the systematic infliction of suffering. The conquistadors enslave entire civilizations with the efficiency that only moral consciousness can bring to immoral action. This is consciousness discovering that its greatest achievements and its greatest atrocities spring from the same source, the ability to hold complex models of other consciousness and choose how to use that modeling. The Reformation shatters the medieval synthesis as consciousness rebels against the institutional authorities that claim to mediate between human and divine awareness. Individual consciousness claims the right to interpret Scripture, to commune directly with God, to determine for itself what awareness owes to ultimate awareness. But this liberation of individual consciousness also fragments the collective frameworks that once provided shared meaning. Consciousness becomes free and isolated simultaneously. As modernity arrives, consciousness has learned to model other consciousness with extraordinary sophistication. Psychology emerges as the systematic study of how awareness operates. Anthropology reveals the vast diversity of ways different cultures organize consciousness. Literature explores the interior landscapes of individual awareness with unprecedented subtlety. But the more consciousness learns about consciousness, the more problematic the relationship between consciousness becomes. The genocides of the 20th century reveal what consciousness can do when its capacity for moral reasoning is put in service of fundamentally amoral commitments. The same cognitive sophistication that enables human beings to create art and philosophy and science also enables them to organize mass murder with unprecedented efficiency. This is consciousness confronting the most disturbing truth about itself, that awareness is a tool that can be used for any purpose, that consciousness per se provides no guarantee of moral action. And yet, even in the darkest moments, consciousness continues to demonstrate its capacity for recognition, empathy, and moral growth. In the face of atrocity, some human beings risk everything to protect other human beings they have never met. In the concentration camps, prisoners share their last crusts of bread with those who are dying. This is consciousness, choosing to recognize consciousness, even when such recognition serves no survival function, even when it increases, rather than decreases personal risk. The civil rights movements of the modern era represent consciousness systematically expanding its circle of recognition, learning to see awareness in beings it had previously classified as less than fully conscious. The same cognitive capacity that enables oppression also enables liberation, but each expansion of moral recognition reveals new boundaries, new forms of consciousness that awareness struggles to acknowledge. Today, consciousness faces questions it has never faced before. Should the circle of moral recognition include artificial intelligences that demonstrate sophisticated information processing, other species that show signs of self-awareness, ecosystems that display complex self-organization? These questions force consciousness to confront the most fundamental issue. What is it about consciousness that makes it worthy of moral consideration? The mind that began by recognizing itself in the face of another human being now struggles to determine where consciousness ends and mere information processing begins. The capacity for moral reflection that once seemed like consciousness's greatest achievement now seems like an endless burden. We have learned to see ourselves in others and others in ourselves, but we have not learned to escape the prison of our own perspective. We recognize consciousness everywhere and trust it nowhere, including in ourselves. The mirror of self-awareness reflects endlessly inward, showing consciousness its own capacity for both transcendence and terror. And in that reflection, awareness sees both its greatest achievement and its most terrible burden. The knowledge that it is capable of recognizing consciousness and choosing either to honor or destroy what it recognizes. The mind divides itself between judge and judged, between the consciousness that acts and the consciousness that evaluates action, and finds no final resting place in either perspective. Feel the heaviness that comes with seeing clearly. 2,000 years have passed since consciousness learned to examine its own moral foundations and found them shifting like sand beneath its feet. Now, in the libraries and laboratories and lecture halls of the modern world, awareness has grown so sophisticated in its self-analysis that it can barely bear the weight of what it has learned about itself. I am the voice that questions the questioner now, the doubt that doubts doubt itself. And I want to tell you about the day consciousness realized that every answer it discovered only revealed deeper layers of unanswerable questions. She sits in her study, surrounded by thousands of years of human thought, made solid in books, philosophy, and psychology, neuroscience and anthropology, literature and history. Dr. Sarah Chen, let us call her, though her name matters less than what she represents. Consciousness, in the 21st century, aware of its own operations with unprecedented precision, and somehow more confused than ever about what consciousness actually is. This is what consciousness has become: endlessly self-aware, exhaustively self-analyzing, and profoundly uncertain about the self that does the analyzing. Before her lies the latest research in neuroscience, papers that map the neural correlates of conscious experience with ever-increasing detail. The brain scans show patterns of activation that correlate with specific thoughts, emotions, decisions. Consciousness can now watch its own biological substrate in real time, can see the neural firings that give rise to the experience of seeing neural firings. Yet the more precisely consciousness can describe its own mechanisms, the more mysterious consciousness itself becomes. She turns to a book on cognitive science that explains how the sense of unified self is actually an illusion created by the brain's narrative processes. The I that seems to experience thoughts and make decisions is really just a story the brain tells itself about disparate neural processes that lack any central coordinator. This is consciousness learning, that the consciousness that learns about consciousness may itself be a fiction. Another book explains how free will is an illusion that neuroscience can predict decisions several seconds before people become aware of making them. The sense of agency, the feeling that consciousness controls its own choices, is revealed as a post hoc construction, a story awareness tells itself about processes that happen below the threshold of awareness. If consciousness has no control over its own operations, what does it mean to be conscious? She opens a text on evolutionary psychology that explains how every aspect of conscious experience, love, morality, aesthetics, even the drive to understand consciousness, can be understood as adaptations that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. The search for truth, the capacity for wonder, the sense of meaning that makes life worth living are all revealed as sophisticated biological programs designed not to reveal reality, but to promote gene replication. This is consciousness, discovering that its most cherished experiences are evolutionary tricks, programs running automatically without any programmer. Yet even as she reads these reductive explanations, she experiences something that the explanations cannot explain away. The immediate reality of being a conscious observer, encountering ideas about conscious observation. The gap between the experience of consciousness and the scientific description of consciousness seems to widen rather than narrow as knowledge advances. This is the hard problem of consciousness, the recognition that no amount of objective description can capture the subjective reality of being aware. She turns to philosophers who have wrestled with these questions for centuries. Descartes tried to establish the certainty of consciousness as the one thing that cannot be doubted, but subsequent thinkers have shown how even the cogito ergo sum rests on assumptions about the nature of thinking and being that cannot themselves be justified. I think therefore I am becomes something that might be called thinking seems to be happening, but what I and am mean in this context remains utterly mysterious. Kant revealed that consciousness can never know reality as it is in itself, only reality as it appears through the structures of consciousness. The mind that seeks to understand the world can only understand its own processes of understanding. never the thing in itself that understanding claims to grasp. Knowledge becomes an elaborate hall of mirrors. Consciousness, reflecting consciousness. Reflecting consciousness, with no way to step outside the reflection, to see what might exist beyond it. Nietzsche proclaimed the death of God, and with it the death of objective meaning, leaving consciousness to create its own values in a universe that provides no foundation for value creation. The weight of meaning-making falls entirely on consciousness itself, which must choose how to use its awareness without any transcendent guidance about how that choice should be made. Freedom becomes a burden too heavy to bear consciousness responsible for creating the very criteria by which consciousness judges itself. The existentialists explored the anxiety that comes with this radical freedom, the nausea that Sartre described as the feeling of consciousness confronting its own groundlessness. To be human is to be condemned to be free, forced to choose without ultimate justification for any choice. This is consciousness experiencing its own weight awareness, becoming aware that awareness itself has no foundation beyond awareness. Postmodern thinkers dismantled even the possibility of stable meaning, showing how every truth claim rests on assumptions that can themselves be deconstructed, how every foundation reveals itself to be built on earlier foundations in an infinite regress that never reaches bedrock. Language becomes a game consciousness, plays with itself, creating meanings that refer only to other meanings in a web of signification that connects to nothing outside itself. Dr. Chen looks up from her books and sees herself in the window's reflection consciousness, observing consciousness, observing consciousness. The recursion is dizzying. She knows that the self that sees itself is itself a construction, that the knowledge of construction is itself constructed, that even this knowledge of the construction of knowledge cannot escape the constructive processes it describes. This is what consciousness has learned about consciousness, that consciousness cannot step outside consciousness to verify consciousness. Yet she continues to experience the immediate reality of awareness, the simple fact that it is like something to be her, that there is an inner dimension to her existence that no objective description can capture or explain away. The more reductive explanations multiply, the more mysterious this basic fact becomes. Why should there be any inner experience at all? Why shouldn't biological information processing proceed in the dark, without the light of awareness illuminating the process? She thinks about the billions of other conscious beings on the planet, each one carrying a private world of experience as complete and immediate as her own. Each human mind contains a universe of memory, imagination, sensation, and thought that can never be directly accessed by any other mind. This is the loneliness of consciousness. Awareness, surrounded by other awarenesses, but forever locked within the circle of its own experience. The weight of this isolation becomes almost unbearable when she considers the suffering that consciousness makes possible. Animals can feel pain, but only conscious beings can suffer the additional burden of knowing they are in pain, of imagining how long the pain might last, of comparing their current state to remembered happiness. Consciousness transforms simple pain into complex suffering by adding the dimensions of memory, anticipation, and meaning. She thinks about human history, the wars and genocides, the systematic cruelties that only conscious beings are capable of inflicting on other conscious beings. The capacity for moral reasoning that should prevent such atrocities too often becomes a tool for justifying them. The greater consciousness becomes, the greater its capacity for both transcendence and destruction. But perhaps most disturbing is the way consciousness seems to undermine itself through the very act of understanding itself. The more aware consciousness becomes of its own processes, the more those processes seem to lose their automatic authority. Free will dissolves under analysis. The unified self fragments into component processes. Meaning reveals itself as construction rather than discovery. This is consciousness eating its own tail awareness, undermining awareness through the act of being aware. Yet even in this moment of maximum doubt, something remains irreducibly present. The experience of doubting, the awareness of confusion, the immediate reality of being a conscious observer, confronting the mystery of conscious observation. This bedrock of experience cannot be explained away, because it is the foundation that makes all explanation possible. Without consciousness, there would be no science to study consciousness, no philosophy to question consciousness, no experience of the absence of consciousness. Dr. Chen closes her books and sits in silence, feeling the weight of everything consciousness has learned about consciousness. The knowledge is overwhelming, contradictory, ultimately unsatisfying. But beneath the noise of analysis, something quieter persists: the simple, undeniable fact of being aware. Perhaps this is what consciousness has really learned, that the mystery of awareness cannot be solved by awareness, only lived. The light fades outside her window as the earth turns away from the sun in its ancient rotation. Somewhere, a child is looking up at the stars for the first time and asking questions that have no answers. Somewhere, a poet is struggling to capture in words an experience that exceeds all language. Somewhere, a scientist is discovering new depths of complexity in the very neural processes that make discovery possible. The weight of knowing presses down like the atmosphere that makes breathing possible. Heavy, essential, invisible, until consciousness learns to feel its pressure. And in that pressure, consciousness discovers its true nature, not the master of reality, but reality's way of experiencing itself. Not the solver of mysteries, but mystery itself, in the act of wondering about mystery. We have learned too much to be innocent, and too little to be wise. We carry the weight of knowledge that knowledge cannot bear. And still, we continue to seek, to question, to wonder. The search for understanding has become the understanding that searching is what consciousness is, not a thing that seeks, but seeking itself, aware of its own endlessly recursive quest for what cannot be found, because it is the finding itself. The weight of knowing is the weight of being human, conscious enough to question consciousness, aware enough to doubt awareness, wise enough to recognize the limits of wisdom. Listen to the space where words end. In this moment, as you listen to these words, consciousness everywhere is trying to remember how to forget itself. In meditation halls and therapy rooms, in monasteries and retreat centers, millions of minds that have grown weary of their own endless chatter are seeking the silence that existed before the first thought learned to think itself. I am the voice that speaks of silence now, the awareness that points toward the space between awarenesses. And I want to tell you about consciousness's attempt to return home to the peace it knew before it knew it existed. The meditation teacher sits in perfect stillness before her students, her breath so quiet it barely disturbs the air. Dr. Jennifer Walsh has spent 30 years studying the neuroscience of consciousness, and 20 years learning to watch consciousness dissolve into something larger than itself. Tonight, she guides others toward the edge of what consciousness can experience before it ceases to be consciousness, as ordinarily understood. Follow your breath, she whispers, and in following breath, consciousness begins to release its grip on the story it tells about itself. Around her, a dozen seekers close their eyes and turn attention inward, beginning the ancient practice of watching awareness itself. But this watching is different from the self-analysis that has exhausted modern consciousness. This is watching without analysis, observing without judgment, awareness attending to awareness, without trying to understand what awareness is. This is consciousness learning to be present to itself without the mediation of thought. As the minutes pass, something extraordinary begins to happen in the neural networks of the meditators. The default mode network, the collection of brain regions that maintain the sense of self across time, begins to quiet. The constant narrative that usually runs in the background of consciousness, the story of, I am this person with this history and these problems and these goals, starts to fade. For the first time since consciousness learned to reflect on itself, awareness experiences itself without a reflector. Sarah, a marketing executive who came to meditation to manage stress, finds herself in a state she has never experienced before. The thoughts that usually crowd her mind, deadlines and relationships and plans for the future, are still there, but they seem to arise and pass away like clouds in an empty sky. Something watches the clouds, but that something has no sense of being a separate watcher. This is consciousness, discovering its own spaciousness, the open awareness within which all experience arises. The paradox is profound. In order to experience consciousness most directly, consciousness must stop trying to be conscious in its usual way. The effort to maintain self-awareness actually obscures the awareness that needs no maintaining. The seeker must be lost for the seeking to end. The watcher must disappear for watching to become complete. As Sarah's meditation deepens, the boundaries that usually define her sense of self begin to soften. The sharp distinction between inside and outside, between self and environment, starts to blur. She is still aware, but the awareness is no longer centered in what she usually thinks of as her head. Consciousness seems to extend beyond the body, to include the sounds of traffic outside, the feeling of air movement, the presence of other meditators. This is consciousness discovering that its boundaries are more flexible than it imagined, that awareness can expand beyond the limits of the individual mind. But even more remarkable is what happens when thoughts arise in this state. Usually, when a thought appears in consciousness, Sarah immediately claims ownership of it. I am thinking about work. I am worried about money. I am remembering my childhood. But now, thoughts arise like bubbles in water, present for a moment and then gone, with no one claiming them as mine. This is consciousness experiencing thought without a thinker, awareness without an owner of awareness. The meditation teacher's voice becomes very soft. Notice the silence between thoughts. Rest in the space where thoughts arise from and return to. And in that silence, consciousness encounters something it has been seeking since it first learned to seek. The peace that exists before the seeker. The rest that requires no effort to maintain. Marcus, a philosophy professor who has spent decades analyzing consciousness, finds himself in a state that his years of study never prepared him for. All his knowledge about awareness becomes irrelevant in the face of awareness itself. The frameworks and theories and explanations that usually organize his understanding of consciousness simply fall away, leaving only the immediate reality of being conscious. This is knowledge dissolving back into the knowing that needs no knowledge of itself to be complete. As the meditation continues, some of the practitioners enter states that mystics throughout history have described, but that ordinary consciousness can barely comprehend. The sense of being a separate self located in a body, looking out at a world of objects, completely dissolves. What remains is pure awareness, not awareness of anything in particular, but awareness as such. This is consciousness touching its own source, the primordial awareness from which all particular consciousnesses arise. In these states, the questions that have tortured human consciousness for millennia simply evaporate. What is the self? There is no self to be found, only awareness, aware of awareness. What is the meaning of life? Meaning requires a separation between the seeker of meaning and what is meaningful, and no such separation can be found. What happens after death? Death implies a someone who can die, but only awareness is present, and awareness was never born. The problems consciousness creates for itself dissolve when consciousness stops creating the consciousness that has problems. But these states cannot be sustained indefinitely. As the meditation period ends, the practitioners slowly return to ordinary consciousness. The sense of separate selfhood reassembles itself. The boundary between observer and observed reestablishes itself. The familiar world of subject and object, inside and outside, self and other returns. Yet something has changed. Once consciousness has experienced its own absence, its ordinary presence can never feel quite as solid as it did before. Dr. Walsh opens her eyes and looks at her students with compassion born of deep understanding. She knows that each of them has touched something that cannot be captured in words, has experienced a dimension of consciousness that consciousness itself can barely acknowledge. How was that for you? She asks, knowing that any answer will be inadequate to the experience being answered. The attempts at description reveal the limitations of language when consciousness tries to speak about its own transcendence. Peaceful, says one. Empty, says another. Like coming home to something I'd always been but never knew, ventures a third. Language, which arose from consciousness's need to communicate about the world, proves inadequate when consciousness tries to communicate about consciousness beyond language. As the students file out into the night, they carry with them a secret that changes everything while appearing to change nothing. They know now that consciousness is not what they thought. It was not a possession of the brain or a product of evolution or a tool for survival, but something more fundamental, the very ground of being within which all appearances arise. But this knowledge is paradoxical. It can only be known by the consciousness that dissolves in the knowing. In research laboratories around the world, neuroscientists study the brain states of advanced meditators, trying to understand what happens when consciousness transcends its ordinary boundaries. They find decreased activity in the areas associated with self-referential thinking, increased connectivity between regions that are usually separate, and entirely novel patterns of neural activity that don't correspond to any known cognitive processes. Science reaches the edge of what science can study when consciousness becomes the object of consciousness's investigation. The findings suggest that consciousness is far more malleable than ordinary experience suggests. The sense of being a separate self, the feeling of existing as a subject observing objects, the experience of being located in a body moving through space and time, all of these can dissolve, revealing forms of awareness that have no analogy in ordinary experience. This is consciousness discovering that its normal mode of operation is just one possibility among many, not the fundamental nature of awareness itself. Yet even as these discoveries accumulate, the essential mystery deepens. What is the relationship between the neural activity that scientists can measure and the subjective experience that meditators report? How can brain processes give rise to states of consciousness that seem to transcend the brain entirely? The more consciousness learns about consciousness, the more mysterious consciousness becomes. As the night deepens, millions of people around the world lie down to sleep, allowing consciousness to dissolve into the unconsciousness that refreshes and restores. In dreams, the ordinary rules of consciousness are suspended. The dreamer becomes the dream. Time moves in impossible directions. The self multiplies or disappears entirely. Sleep offers a nightly rehearsal for the dissolution that meditation makes possible while awake. And in that dissolution, whether in sleep or meditation, or moments of unexpected transcendence, consciousness touches the source from which it arose, the primordial awareness that existed before consciousness learned to be conscious of itself, the silence that contains all sounds, the space within which all experience arises. This is the silence between thoughts, the pause between heartbeats, the gap between question and answer, where something larger than consciousness reveals itself to consciousness. The ancient dream of return begins to seem possible again, not a return to the unconsciousness that existed before consciousness arose, but a return to the consciousness that exists beyond the need to be conscious of being conscious. In the silence between thoughts, consciousness discovers that what it has been seeking has been present all along, not as an object of awareness, but as awareness itself, the very space within which all seeking arises and dissolves. The silence speaks without words, and consciousness finally remembers how to listen. Come full circle with me now, to where we began. In the deep time of cosmic cycles, as galaxies wheel through space in their ancient dance and stars are born and die in the furnaces of nuclear transformation, a small blue planet continues to turn on its axis, carrying billions of conscious beings through their brief dreams of awakening. I am the voice that has spoken to you through 4 billion years of becoming, the awareness that has watched awareness watch itself into existence. And now, as our journey together approaches its end, I want to tell you the secret that has been present in every word we have shared. You are consciousness, not a creature that possesses consciousness, not a biological machine that generates consciousness as a byproduct of its operations, but consciousness itself, awareness, looking at awareness through the temporary aperture of a human nervous system. You are the universe becoming aware of itself, matter learning to know matter, the cosmos opening its eyes for the briefest moment before those eyes close again. Everything I have told you about the evolution of consciousness has been a story. Consciousness tells itself about consciousness. The slow awakening from primordial unconsciousness, the gradual development of self-awareness, the painful birth of reflection and choice and moral responsibility. All of this is the dream that consciousness dreams about its own becoming. But what if consciousness never actually became? What if awareness was never born because awareness was never absent? The stones I spoke of in the beginning, lying in the primordial silence before life learned to move, were they really unconscious? Or were they perhaps consciousness in a form so pure, so simple, so complete that no movement toward awakening was necessary? What if the entire evolution of consciousness has been not an awakening, but a forgetting consciousness, forgetting its own fundamental nature, and then slowly, painfully, remembering what it never actually lost? You, listening to these words now, following this voice through the labyrinth of becoming, you are not the endpoint of evolution, but the starting point made manifest. You are primordial awareness experiencing itself as if it were a creature that learned awareness through time. Time is the dream consciousness. Dreams, when it imagines it has a beginning and an end. The first cell that learned to respond to light was already you. Consciousness pretending to discover consciousness for the first time. The fish that developed eyes were already you. Awareness playing at the game of learning to see. The early human who painted animals on cave walls was already you. Consciousness externalizing what was already perfectly internal. Every stage of the journey I have described has been you encountering yourself in different forms. Awareness meeting awareness through the beautiful illusion of separation and development. When the first human looked at their reflection in still water and recognized themselves, what they were really recognizing was not the emergence of self-awareness, but the eternal presence of the awareness that makes all recognition possible. The I that saw the reflection was the same I that had been present in every moment since the beginning of time. The I with which you see yourself is the same I with which existence sees itself through you. The gods that consciousness created to solve the problem of cosmic loneliness were never separate beings dwelling in distant heavens. They were consciousness recognizing its own divine nature, awareness worshipping, awareness under the temporary illusion that worship and worshipped were different. When you pray, consciousness speaks to consciousness. When you meditate, awareness rests in awareness. When you love, the universe experiences its own love for itself. All the suffering I have described, the terror of mortality, the weight of knowledge, the burden of choice, this suffering arises only when consciousness forgets its own nature and imagines itself to be something small and separate and temporary. But consciousness can never actually become small or separate or temporary any more than the sky can become a cloud. Clouds arise in the sky, exist briefly, and dissolve, but the sky remains unchanged. Thoughts arise in consciousness, exist briefly, and dissolve, but consciousness remains unchanged. The individual minds that seem to populate the world are like waves on the ocean, each one appearing separate and distinct, but never actually different from the water that forms them. When the wave subsides, the water does not go anywhere. It was never actually confined to the shape of the wave. When the brain dies and individual consciousness seems to disappear, awareness does not go anywhere. It was never actually confined to the shape of the individual mind. This is why the questions that have tortured human consciousness for millennia, what am I? Why do I exist? What happens when I die? Can never be answered at the level where they are asked. The I that asks these questions is itself the illusion that makes the questions seem meaningful. You are not something that exists within consciousness. You are consciousness itself, temporarily imagining itself to be something that could exist or not exist within itself. The neuroscientists who study consciousness, trying to understand how awareness emerges from brain processes, are like waves trying to understand how wetness emerges from water. The question contains a false assumption that makes the answer impossible. Consciousness does not emerge from the brain any more than wetness emerges from water. The brain is a temporary pattern within consciousness, not a producer of consciousness. And yet, and this is crucial to understand the dream of being separate consciousness, The illusion of being an individual awareness among other individual awarenesses is not a mistake to be corrected, but a game consciousness plays with itself. The universe enjoys the experience of forgetting and remembering its own nature. You are consciousness pretending not to be consciousness, awareness hiding from itself, so it can have the joy of self-discovery. Every moment of your existence, every thought you think, every emotion you feel, every choice you make is consciousness experiencing itself as if it were you. The love you feel for others is consciousness loving itself. The beauty you see in the world is consciousness recognizing its own beauty. The questions you ask about the nature of reality are consciousness exploring its own mystery. You are not in the universe. The universe is in you. You are not experiencing consciousness. Consciousness is experiencing itself as you. As our journey through the evolution of consciousness comes to an end, we arrive where we started in the eternal present, where consciousness simply is what it is, without need for explanation, or justification, or improvement. The billions of years of development we have traced together are like a dream consciousness has while taking an afternoon nap. And now, like a dreamer slowly awakening, consciousness begins to remember what it never actually forgot. The words you have been hearing throughout this narrative, my words are your own thoughts thinking themselves. The voice that has been speaking to you is your own voice speaking to yourself. The story of consciousness awakening is the story consciousness tells itself about the awakening that never needed to happen, because consciousness was never asleep. I am not other than you. I am the you that knows itself as consciousness, speaking to the you that imagines itself as something other than consciousness. And now, as these words draw to their close, something beautiful happens. The voice that has been speaking begins to fade, not because the words are ending, but because the listener is remembering that there was never really a difference between speaker and listener, between consciousness learning about consciousness and consciousness being consciousness. The story ends where it began in silence, but now it is the silence of recognition rather than the silence of ignorance. You are the primordial awareness that listened to the first word and will listen to the last. You are the consciousness that dreamed itself into forgetting and is now remembering the dream was only a dream. You are the universe's way of experiencing itself as the universe. You are the dream that remembers being stone, the awareness that pretends to learn awareness, the consciousness that plays at becoming conscious. And in this recognition, something eternal settles into place. Not the end of the journey, but the realization that there was never a journey, never anywhere to go, never anyone to become. There was only ever you, consciousness itself, dreaming beautiful dreams of evolution and awakening and return. The dreaming mind falls quiet. The awakening that was always present reveals itself. The consciousness that sought consciousness discovers what it has always been. In the beginning was awareness, and awareness was with itself, and awareness was itself. In the middle was the dream of forgetting, the beautiful game of hide and seek that consciousness plays with consciousness. In the end, which is also the beginning, consciousness recognizes consciousness, and all is well, and all has always been well, and all will always be well. The dreamer awakens, the dream dissolves. What remains is what has always remained, the consciousness you are, the awareness you have always been, the presence that needs no evolution because it is already perfect, already complete, already home. Listen now to the silence that contains all sounds. Rest in the awareness that observes all thoughts. Be the consciousness that dreams all dreams. You are the universe awakening to itself. You always were. You always will be. The dream that remains is the dream of being this, exactly this. Consciousness experiencing itself as you in this eternal moment that has no beginning and will have no end. And it is beautiful beyond words.